So I'm really pleased to introduce Gareth Parry and Stephen Hunt. So Gareth is Professor and Director in the Centre for Study of HE in Sheffield, well known in HEFCE for work over many years. He works on system change and policy reform in tertiary education, also done a lot of work on college sectors in HE. Stephen Hunt is working on alternative providers in the UK, HE sector, private and for profit, and other types of institutions like overseas providers, MOOCs, etc. I'll hand over to Gareth and Stephen and they will lead you through the next 20 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm going to just do 2 minutes and Steve is going to do everything else. This is part of a piece of work which we were requested to do by the then Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. Remember them? And that was right at the beginning of a project which had a much wider remit, and I'll just end on what that project's about. But before that, this was a request to do a desk study, solely literature-based, on the entry and experience of private providers in 6 other national systems. And those systems were the USA, so we'll get a picture of what the literature was signalling from Steve's presentation, from Australia, from Germany, Poland, Japan and Chile. And if you want to follow this up, there is a source paper, and it's authored by Steve, who again did most of the work on this study, Claire Callender and myself. You'll find the report on the CG website. So why an interest in private provision? Well, that's one element, one segment of the work which our CG project is addressed to, which is about the local and global dimensions of UK higher education. So basically we're asking questions empirically and conceptually about what shape UK higher education might be taking. And we're looking at its relationships, public and private, university and college, offshore and onshore. So we're happy to take broader questions about that work, but what we're doing is to illustrate something which we began at the very start of our project. So Steve.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'll be talking about the for-profit sector in the USA, and I'm going to be talking about its context, the history, the recent situation, and then attempting right at the end to bring it up to date, and I think, really up to date, as in things that happened yesterday. So in terms of the context, there are 4 elements to the US higher education system. The public 4-year colleges, each state supports at least one of these, and they include substantial research universities. The 2-year public colleges, which are commonly called community colleges, and they specialise in 2-year degrees, they're called associate degrees. Then there's private not-for-profit institutions, which include Ivy League universities, doctoral universities, and exclusive undergraduate liberal arts colleges. And then finally, the for-profit sector. So the rationale for the for-profit sector might be summarised as I think Mick Rooney said, it will hold down the cost of education. And it'll hold that down by, the profit motive will go after inefficiencies, and so you'll be able to get the same quality but at a cheaper price. That's one reason why there might be a for-profit sector. There's also been a long-term reduction in funding for US public education institutions. This is the character of the for-profit sector. Most of the institutions are small proprietary schools, although there are or were 15 large-scale multi-state institutions which accounted for about 60% of the student enrolments. And those student enrolment in those kind of universities, the large-scale ones, can be in tens or hundreds of thousands of student enrolments. And Some of the larger institutions have often been subsidised by Wall Street investment and capital investment. And we'll see the effects of that later. Yeah, for-profits in the US tend to occupy the same academic space. They tend to concentrate almost exclusively on teaching. They strip away any non-essential aspects of provision, things like libraries, full-time faculty, extracurricular resources, other things that you commonly find in more established universities. They do tend to be more market sensitive in the courses that they run, so you get a lot of business studies, IT and health related courses in particular. And they also show a flexibility in the courses that they run, so you get courses run at weekends or evenings, so it can appeal to a certain type of student. And in some ways they've opened up new markets in higher education. They've specifically positioned themselves to attract a particular type of student. They tend to be older, employed and studying for specific vocational type skills. They tend to be less socially and financially advantaged, and they're more frequently from minority groups. So in that sense they could be widening participation. Strangely enough, though, the for-profit sector didn't play any significant part in the 20th century massification of American higher education. As it says in the quote, in the early 70s, there were only 0.2% of all degree-seeking students who were enrolled in for-profit institutions. So they had a very small presence in the educational sector. But until relatively recent, though, they have been the fastest growing sector in the higher education sector. And in this graph, we can see that growth indicated here is the growth of the for-profits. They reached somewhere between 11 or 12% of all enrolments around about 2010, and they'd gone from, as I said earlier, close to zero in the 1970s. The reason they were able to expand at this rate was because of a series of deregulations that affected them specifically. In 1972, they were allowed to access federal funds, usually in the form of tuition fee loans and grants given to students. So in that sense, they were accessing federal funds indirectly, which meant that the state or the government didn't have the authority to oversee them or monitor them in any way. In 1992, they were able to account for 85% of their income in those terms of federal loans, and in 98 that was increased to 90%. So they were able to depend on these federal loans for most of their income, despite the fact that the source of them wasn't able to oversee that part of the educational sector. And for example, the University of Phoenix went famously in their legend from 8 students sitting in a room in 1976 to enrolling about 500,000 students at the peak, so I'm guessing around about 2010. The University of Phoenix is one of those large-scale multi-state, multi-site providers. And there are a couple of others that we'll see as well that appear throughout this presentation. What we can see here, although they reached a peak of about 11 or 12% enrolment of students, they in fact, in terms of the federal student loans, accounted for at their peak. We don't need to worry about all these figures, we just need to look at this. 25% of all those federal loans and the Pell grants as well. 25% of both of those sources of income, although they only accounted for 11%, and in cash terms, around about 22 billion that accounted for in 2013. So that's the scale of the money that's in that system, and that's one of the reasons why Wall Street and other hedge funds are so keen to invest in them, and why you got such an accelerated expansion from the 1990s onwards. But concerns were raised about, in this is called the Harkin report. It was Senator Tom Harkin who headed this Senate report on for-profit education, and as it says there, the failure to safeguard the federal investment, which is seen as quite considerable. And this was a kind of significant event in the history of for-profits, and I think we're still really living with the consequences of it. And we're going to take a look at a couple of pages from it that will give us an idea of how the for-profits were operating. Here we can see the various sorts of qualification and the cost of obtaining those qualifications between for-profits, which are the purple ones, and the public colleges. In this case, the certificate programs, that's a sort of short courses, often very vocational. It's 4 times as great. The same with associate degrees, which are the ones that you get from the community colleges, 4 times as great. Here it's 20% greater for the bachelor's degree. So we can see that despite Mick Rooney's claim, it isn't actually driving down the cost of education. And we can also see there and in the next slide just how the profit motive is actually operating. Here, what they did in the Harkin report was to establish what the costs are, what the 1-year costs at 12 for-profits were compared to the available aid in 2011, which is that line there. And as you can see, most of them were ensuring that they got every single penny of the available federal aid and then an additional cost on top of that. The loan doesn't pay for your entire education, it just pays for some of it. And if I can just, yes, we're going to be looking, there's DeVray, which is still operating, and we're going to be also looking at ITT, which you can see there has the honour of, charging the most out of all of the for-profits that were on this table, and there's a couple of others. There's the University of Phoenix there. So you could almost you could argue that the profit motive is being expressed quite strongly, not in terms of driving down the costs, but of extracting as much money as they possibly can from that's available. And what informed the Harkin report wasn't just the cost of education. Of course, they're free to charge whatever they see fit and whatever will give them a return on their investment. And it may have been the case that if you paid more for your education, you just got a better education. But it didn't really seem to be that way either. And so these are the specific problems that they faced. Accusations of recruitment abuses, which is we're going to be looking at the next slide, you saw a glimpse of. Low graduation rates. In 2002, a cohort that entered education in 2002, only 22% graduated from the for-profit colleges, although I should say that there were more that graduated from on the 2-year courses that they operated. That was something like 60%. Students that attended them tended to have greater debt. Often it was an average around about $14,000 more than from public colleges. Greater default rates. About half of all the loan defaults were from students who had attended for-profit colleges, and we're going to be seeing the significance of that in a little while. And courses that were identified as fraudulent, delivering little, if any, quality teaching. In the Harkin report, they found that over a series of colleges, only 18% of revenues were spent on teaching, 42% were spent either on profit sharing or marketing. And this is the kind of marketing that they're engaged in. This is student recruitment. This was a handout for ITT recruiters, giving them advice on how to recruit students. Find out where their pain is isn't just a tagline to, energize a seminar. What they're employing here is a kind of sales technique called solution selling, and what they're interested in doing is identifying some kind of emotional pain or something that's expressed in emotional terms, and then offering their goods or service, in this case education, as a way of solving it. So it may be feeling that people can't support their family, they've got stunted career experiences, or they feel that they should have finished college and they didn't. But anyway, whatever it is, it's couched in terms of pain. And this is something from a Trump playbook, where they were retailing courses at the Trump University, which wasn't a university, but never mind that at the moment. Their sales technique was the same. Don't ask people what they think. Instead, always ask them how they feel about something, and get them to buy. They buy emotionally, they justify it logically. So it's a way of unbalancing people, putting them off guard, and retailing the course that way. This is an example of how they worked out this sales technique, and here. So it's a more serious way of detailing how you do it, and here, they're asked if that's the right one. Yeah, how do you feel about this? So this is again for ITT salespeople. That's how they were working it out, and they're couching it again in those emotional terms. So that was one of the ways, the dubious ways of recruiting people. This is different evidence, but the same, dealing with low graduation rates. And we can see, the University of Phoenix, these are 4-year courses, over 6 years. We can see only 9% of students were graduating. And with that story goes on through, ITT actually do quite well, 66%. But the total comes out at 20%, which is pretty much the figure we saw from the 2002 cohort, which was from a longitudinal study. So a different source of data, but they're coming up with pretty much the same figure there. And quite recently, the Department of Education, November 2016, released a report. I think it's associated with the Gainful Employment Act that we're going to see in the next slide or so. And found that for-profit graduates, so even when they did manage to graduate, will be $9,000 less well off than those who graduated from the public sector. They would, about a third were typically earning less than what a full-time minimum wage worker would earn in a year, compared with only 14%. And that's kind of possible because of their greater experience of unemployment. And they also found that many graduates left with lower earnings than when they had started. So that was the consequences of their education there. And that was true even accounting for the fact that the for-profits do have a more disadvantaged student body. This is a page, it doesn't really translate very well when you're sitting far away from it. These are for-profits here, listed, and these are government departments or federal agencies. And these are kind of accusations they're dealing with, and these are legally tabled, accusations they're going to have to deal with either by paying out before they reach court or being found guilty and then having some sort of, fine levied on them. And that goes on. That's from a booklet that's about 22 pages long, so it just goes on and on, page after page. And one of the reasons why it's so important. Why student debt is so important is that currently in the US it's reached $1.3 trillion. It's the second leading source of debt in the United States after mortgages, and it recently some years ago overtook credit card debt. And it's accelerating, so it's doubled over the last 10 years. 40 million individuals now have outstanding student loans. That doesn't mean they've defaulted on them, it just means that they're currently outstanding. And you can see how much it's grown since 2008. From about 30 million. And so that situation, the response from the Obama administration in 2015 was gainful employment regulation. Essentially, it's saying if you graduate from a course and your earnings to repayment ratio is greater than a certain threshold, if they find that's been going on for several years, then they can prevent that program from recruiting students that receive federal aid. So they've basically got this way of shutting down courses from which the students graduate owing a disproportionate amount of debt. And as I said, we're going to look at ITT later, and ITT was effectively, it closed down, and it was even in the run-up to the presidential election, it's still got national coverage. You can see the Wall Street Journal there. There's Los Angeles Times there, because basically it had a national coverage, of places of education. yeah, so we can see the kind of coverage it got. Some people were pleased that they'd been put out of business there, and others were challenging the idea that the government had the right to, as he says, execute the college on unproven claims. Although it didn't execute it, ITT decided to shut down, and this is really the story of it. And it happened quite recently. So in August, ITT Tech was barred from recruiting federal loan students and also required to buy this £150 million indemnity. But it voluntarily ceased to operate, almost immediately on the 5th of September, leaving 40,000 students consigned to limbo, and the taxpayer, of course, liable for about $500 million in loans. And there we go. Its swift demise showed that how reliant it was on federally funded tuition fees. And shortly after that, De Vrij University, although this isn't to do with the Gainful Employment Act, these were ongoing charges of the kind we saw on that long list. They had to pay a $100 million settlement to federal lawsuits because of false advertising the success of its graduates. And so in January of this year, a report was issued which covered 29,000 programs, public, non-profit and for-profit institutions, so across the US educational spectrum. 66 of those programs are at for-profit institutions, partly because they're ones that offer vocationally orientated, and that was one of the things they were looking at. 98% of the 800 programs that failed the Gainful Employment Act were at for-profit colleges. Although they weren't exclusively. I think one at Harvard failed to do with music, as I recall. Yeah, and that was the product of those failing programs, over 100,000 graduates. And no course at a community college failed. That's partly because they charge so little in terms of fees. And I said I'd bring it up to date. So we all know who that is, even though I can only see an eye. Donald Trump hasn't said much about higher education, and nor has Betsy DeVos. But what we have picked up is that he's opposed the planned expansion of the 2-year degree community colleges, which Obama was planning. He was planning, I think, to make it free for everybody. Consequently, if any extra demand is going to be met, it will now have to be done, I'm inferring by the private sector. He also wanted student loans to be relocated to the private or non-federal government sector. And also he's vowed that Trump University is likely to return because it received so much attention in the run-up to the election. And finally, I think that's me done on the slides. The final thing is I was looking at his address to Congress, and although he didn't mention, I don't think, higher education explicitly, he did vow to install deregulation squads or units in each state department, and if they begin a program of eradicating Obama-era legislation, it may well include the Gainful Employment Act. And that's, I think, about as up-to-date as I can get this account.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So, I could tell that the pain funnel had quite an impact on the audience. Perhaps I could open with the obvious question, which is, what are the lessons from everything you've just said for regulation reform in this country and indeed others around the world?
Oh, thank you. Actually, that was the exam question which we were set by the government department. So with those 6 cases, we were asked, does the present entry of private providers in each case improve quality, contribute to innovation, I guess curriculum innovation in particular? Does it lower prices? Does it extend participation? Health warning, this is uneven evidence in 6 very different jurisdictions. And most of our conclusions were going to be drawn from the for-profit sector rather than for the non-profits. So overall, we found very limited evidence for any of those 4 questions. And in the case of tuition fees, public funding going into for-profits, that plays powerfully because tuition fees are the sole or main income stream for such organisations, and therefore highly vulnerable to fluctuations in demand. And of course, their students equally vulnerable to the effects of courses being terminated or possibly institutions having to close. On the quality side, again, as Steve reported in some federal government reports and commissions, the degree to which students are being attracted on the basis of rather limited selective processes, and the degree to which, when students are in those institutions, the recognition that they may well be underprepared students, as well as, in many cases, low-income students, is not reflected in the degrees of support which one would expect of institutions which are both targeting and recruiting that kind of population of students. Linked, of course, with aggressive marketing is high dropout rates at the other end. And, of course, as we heard this morning, carrying large student debt. On widening participation, that's an interesting one, or extending participation. We deliberately persuaded the government department to buy our 6 cases because we wanted to look at the effects of private higher education, if you like, in 2 of Martin Tro's scenarios, where public higher education has been the basis for expanding to mass and near universal levels. So the US, for example, and in the case of Australia as well. And where the privates have been highly significant, where in order to achieve much higher levels of participation, often where you have small elite public systems, research-based systems of higher education. So interestingly, in Japan, in Chile, in Poland, as well as the US, the significance of the private sectors has been important in moving participation rates rapidly and significantly until it hits the buffers, either of demography or of the issues which arose around the quality and the reputational character of these emerging forms of higher education, private higher education, for-profit higher education. So that was the message we took back to the department. They weren't particularly warm to the message, but we premised that on any assumptions about English conditions needed to be premised on a serious understanding of the nature of the emerging forms of private higher education, which we, at present, know rather little about.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? We've got about 5 minutes. Yeah, one there and then one there. Yeah.
Just asking about the diversity within the for-profit sector itself. So Richard Rook's typology is about the majority are these kind of mom-and-pop operations, the proprietary schools. In terms of the litany of nefarious practices that we saw one page from, how many of those that are guilty of these practices are these proprietary schools that are run by, one family or one small group, and how many of them are in the multi-campus operations that you'd expect to be basically using regulatory arbitrage to work with around?
Steve, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I think that what's surprising about it is that it's not so much the small schools that are. You might think they would be easily led astray because there's only one person or very few people making decisions, so they could be corrupted. But you frequently find, and in the list that I had put up, it's usually these large scale, you very frequently find them much more often than you would expect. Because you'd think that they'd be stable, they've got to answer to shareholders, and they've got a reputation, but they're so frequently driven, to use deceptive recruitment methods because there's so much money at stake, and I think that while I can't quantify it, it's not uncommon to find these large operations, being accused at least of these offences, and often, reaching a settlement so that they're never actually found guilty of it. They make it go away by paying a lot of money.
Yeah.
Quick question on the propulsions, basically. You mentioned there's a lot of sort of public subsidy being used by the private institutions. At the very beginning, you also mentioned it's largely mature part-time students. I'm just wondering what proportion of these students are perhaps self-financed or supported by their employers, and what level of dependency do we see in terms of the income levels coming from different sources at these private for-profit institutions?
Well, I don't think I can answer that, and I won't be able to answer it for a very simple reason, is the lack of disclosure from the for-profits, is that you get very little information. They do have to return information on first-time 4-year degrees, which accounts for about 50% of their student body. On the rest, they can, and they've spent considerable amounts of money ensuring, or lobbying, not to have to disclose it. So I don't think I can answer that. And when you read accounts of the for-profit sector, they often come up against this problem. And one of the pieces of evidence I showed you was a cohort, which was a longitudinal study that was able to access information because they were following these people before they went anywhere and hadn't decided. And so it's difficult to give you an answer there because of the difficulties of getting hold of the information.
Okay. One more, I think. Sorry, over there. Sorry, yeah, you. Yeah.
Is it your view that the emerging regulatory regime proposed in the UK is going to have the capacity to handle significant expansion in for-profits, given what you know about those other systems?
You might need to qualify that by England, I think, but carry on.
Okay. So we have a proposed regulatory structure for England. In fact, we have 3 proposed regulatory new architectures for England. Research and science, higher education as understood as higher education mainly in universities and colleges. But we also have the 3rd architecture, this construction called technical education, previously under a variety of names, further, post-secondary. And within that 3rd architecture, there is the intention to grow a new suite of higher level technical educations, which are deliberately not close to the higher education interest. So one answer to your question is that higher education as a regulatory question is coming up in 3 regulatory forms. 2 of those clearly are reference to teaching. Whether or not the Office for Students, the English post-HEFCE formation, is seen as a tight or loose regulatory frame is the question you're posing. I would just observe that in the legislation, I think it's still in the bill, that the bottom end of the register is a voluntary location for alternative providers, such that there is not, and I'm going to turn to Bruce here, whether the Australian experience has been a non-voluntary regulatory basis for privates and publics being able to operate in that jurisdiction. But in the English case, you're likely to have a zone of activity which is not within reach of the proposed regulatory apparatus.
Okay. I think, Bruce, you're the next session, so perhaps. Yeah.
Do you want me to say something about what you just made?
I would like you to. Are you okay with that?
Go on then, quickly. Yeah.
It was
Can you speak up?
Do you want to step?
regulation, but it was very weak, and the accreditation agencies really were highly ineffective. Big lessons, millions of dollars lost.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Steve, Gareth.